Here we have a study that I found. After the end of the last video segment, I kept looking, trying to find a relevant study that was, fairly recent. And this is the first one I came across. Maybe if I would have kept looking, I could have found even better ones, but this one's not bad. So we see here that at the top you can see that, okay, this is 2014, so it's not brand new, but it's not old. Research that's just several years old is not old. We can also see that the title is Violent Behavior and Driving Under the Influence of Alcohol, Prevalence and Association with Impulsivity. So see here, impulsivity is another word for low self-control. So it's relevant. It's dealing with this issue that we want to know, with the connection between impulsivity and violent behavior. That's what we have here, and you can see that the sample that of people that they had for this study were individuals who are in treatment for alcohol dependence. So these are people who have drinking problems, and it happens to be in the country Poland. But that's still relevant because our theory here is there's a connection between impulsivity and violent behavior, and that's really the theory supposed to apply anywhere, not just the United States. So the fact that it's Poland doesn't make it irrelevant, still relevant. And you can see here's all the authors, the co-authors to the study, and that these folks, indeed, some of these people are from Poland, but you also have the Department of Psychiatry, University of Michigan, as well. So it's a collaborative project between these two countries, but they got the data from Poland. And that's perfectly fine. So we found a study that's fairly recent and it's relevant. I mentioned before, there's your key terms right there. Impulsivity shows up. So they're not using the term low self-control, but it's the same idea. So in the study, studies tend to be broken up into several parts. I want to teach you folks that, as well as how to do these literature searches. And so a study is going to typically have an abstract at the very beginning, which is just like a paragraph or two summary of the study. So it's just a short version. It really helps you because this entire study is like 9 pages long, and it's nice to have just a paragraph or two to get at the relevance of the study. And the title makes it seem that it's definitely relevant. But then we can look at the conclusion here. So you have the abstract that'll talk about the background, the research methods that were used to collect the data and analyze the data, the results, the findings that they found for this sample of people, and the conclusion of the study. And their conclusion here is both of the self-reported measures of impulsivity. So self-reported just means that they ask the people who have this alcohol problem, ask them how much trouble they have with impulsivity, with doing things without thinking before they act. And they indicated a higher level of impulsivity among participants from the FUI group versus those from the non-FUI group. So I don't know what FUI means, so we got to go back. Usually what they do is, if they have an abbreviation like that, they will tell you earlier on in the study what that means. I'm not seeing that defined here. Looking for FUI. Okay, so having a fight under the influence of alcohol is what FUI means. So the people who had higher levels of impulsivity were more likely to have gotten into a fight while they were intoxicated. So there you see the study found evidence that people who are more impulsive are more likely to fight when under the influence of alcohol. Okay, so that's support for the hypothesis that low self-control or impulsivity raises the chances that you're going to be physically aggressive, that you're going to get into fights, you're going to attack people, that kind of thing. So we found one study that's relevant. And if we go through here, usually after an abstract, you have an introduction that introduces the topic of impulsivity and violence. And here, they have a lot of this focus of driving under the influence. And driving under the influence, they're focusing on that because they see that as a sign of people being impulsive, being kind of foolish or reckless, and not thinking about how your behavior is going to lead potentially to negative consequences. So they open it up talking about this topic. So a lot of times they'll throw out some statistics of how serious the problem is. Here they're talking about alcohol dependence, of how common it is. And they just open up the subject, very often laying things out of what they're going to talk about and how serious of a problem it is. That's the introduction. Then after they lay out the introduction, a lot of times sometimes they will have a separate section. Really, quite commonly, they'll have a separate section where they'll talk about what do we know already? They'll have their little literature review, which is what we're discussing right now, is how do you put together a literature review. And in at least sociology, criminology, we're likely to have a section that will say, okay, here's a literature review, here's what we already know about the connection between impulsivity and violent behavior. In this study, these guys are psychiatrists. Psychiatrists tend to get a little more to the point and keep things shorter. So it looks like they have, I haven't read through all of this, but it looks like they put what we already know about impulsivity and violence, they put it into the introduction. So all this stuff here and these different parts, they're talking about what other studies have already looked at and what we already know. So in a sociological paper or criminological social work paper, you're probably more likely to have a separate section that talks about, okay, let's talk about all the prior studies that have looked at this. What did they find? And so this is really useful. A literature review section in a paper, especially if the paper is fairly new, is helpful to you because you can look and say, oh, look at their studies that they're citing here. Each one of these numbers is a paper that they're citing, 32, 35. If you go down to the end of the paper, you see the studies that go along with these numbers. So like 35 is right there, and there's the bibliographic information of this study that they're citing where they're looking at impulsivity and here legal problems among men and women, right, with alcohol use disorders. So basically, you can use their literature review, their literature search, and what they found, and you can build on that. You can. It's kind of a platform. What they found, a platform from which you can continue your search for other relevant studies. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about the plagiarism issue? And what you need to make sure and do is you always need to give credit for, well, where does this stuff, who did this study? When you're talking about studies, you need to indicate who did the study, and you give credit for it. And that's in this article. The way that they do that is with this citation formatting here, where they put a number next to each study that they're citing, that they're describing, and then they list that study down at the end, like I just showed you. Now, this is not a formatting system that we typically use in our disciplines. We usually will use either, if you're a sociologist, you'll use ASA, they call it style formatting. Criminology, and I believe social work too, use APA quite a bit, which APA style formatting. And so there's different styles of what you use. This is a different one that you're more likely to see in medical type journals and psychiatric journals where they number it like this. But anyway, there's different systems. But the point is that what they're trying to accomplish here is the same, which is in this section, they're trying to lay out what we already know based on prior studies, and they're just reviewing that. They're just summarizing that. That's what a literature review is. So this study can help you do your summary when you're doing a study. A study like this can help you because it can point you to all these other studies that are relevant, right? When you're writing up your own literature review and doing your own study, you can draw on these to help you come up with this full list of studies that have dealt with this issue, looked into this issue already before. So you see that they have this literature review, again, has been folded in, just included in the introduction, and is kind of a little bit shorter. That's okay. That's the way that you often see it like that in medical journals. They get right to the point. And then here you have materials and methods where they talk about the data, how the data was collected, and the methods they use of doing the study. So who participated in the study, what's the design of the study, how they analyze the data over here, the methods that they use to analyze the data, and then you have the results. The next section, major section that you usually have in a paper is the results, where they tell you what they found. And they go through all the statistics and the numbers if it's a quantitative sort of paper. And they'll include tables that point to the statistics of, this is about the people, the average age of the people who were involved in the study, how many men and how many women, and did they start problem drinking when they were young? You know, how many of them had this early onset of alcohol problems? How many years of heavy alcohol use? Their scores on impulsivity, how impulsive they are. That sort of stuff, right? And then it's just all the statistical analysis that you don't need to worry. This is all technical stuff. But again, it's just a way that they're reporting their results, what they found. And bottom line is they'll have a final section, which will be like called discussion or conclusion, where they go through and they kind of boil it all down and say, this is what we found looking at our data, and maybe they might talk about how this is connected to the research that's been done before, how it's the same, how it's different, how it supports or doesn't support previous research. They'll talk about, you know, maybe some weaknesses in their study, things they wish they could have done a little bit differently, how people can improve and do an even better type of study or take this even further in future research. So they go on a couple of pages here, and the conclusion is just bottom line, just the little summary where they're wrapping it all up in the conclusion. So most papers are going to have discussion, a conclusion, something like that. Not all exactly the same. The final thing that you typically get in a paper is the list of references. All of the studies that you cited throughout your study, and here they're indicated with these numbers, they're all listed here at the end, and you can see that is quite a few. It's a couple of pages here, we do the whole thing, it looks like 60 studies. See, so they did their work. They searched, when they did this study, they searched and they found 60 studies that were relevant for their paper, for their study. And they reviewed all of those, and they cited those, they talked about them throughout the paper, a lot of it in the introduction in the beginning. And that's how you do a paper. So you need to have, your paper needs to have these different kinds of sections in it. What we're talking about here in Chapter 5 is just that early section, the literature review, which, again, the purpose of it is to find out what we already know about the topic, so that from there we can jump off from that point and try to come up with something new that adds somehow, that contributes on top of what we've already learned and what we already know between impulsivity and violent behavior, with this example that we're doing right here. So I just found one study, and I just went through that one study. And if you were going to do a thorough literature review, and you were a real researcher, you would end up going through dozens of studies like they've done here. You would go through dozens of studies and summarize that in a literature review. Summarize what we already know from a literature review. Again, just to repeat, these guys don't really have the whole section of a literature review, just because they shorten it here and they get right to the point, which is okay. But in your disciplines, criminology, sociology, social work, you're more likely to have a separate section that will go over what we already know. Anyway, I wanted to show you this real life example of finding one paper because it's more black and white, and we can go over the chapter materials, but it's so abstract and technical that you don't really, sometimes you're like, what's the professor talking about with the abstract and the literature review, was all that? It's good to see it, and I'll try to do that throughout the semester as much as possible to show you exactly how things are done, so it's a little less abstract than the textbook. So anyway, I will have some things to say about the textbook. We'll go through the PowerPoint notes, but I will tend to shorten and abbreviate that, because I think it's again, most helpful to do what we've just done, to go through a real life example. So anyway, look for those chapter videos. There will be some sections on that as well.